Good morning. Thank you all for being with us today. I call this hearing to order. Whether we want to or not, each and every one of us has a relationship with the IRS. As Benjamin Franklin famously said, in this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes. In the administration of the tax code, the IRS has dual roles, collection and enforcement. Small businesses have a right to be treated fairly on both counts. Unfortunately, that isn't always the case. Many can appreciate that the IRS has a tough job to do. However, the best outcomes are a result from the IRS and taxpayers working together to improve voluntary compliance and efficiently allocate resources. The Small Business Committee has heard from a number of small businesses that have been harmed in one way or another by the IRS. In at least 2 cases, aggressive audits have resulted in these companies actually closing their doors. Today's hearing will focus on some of the ways the IRS can proactively work with small business taxpayers to improve communication and compliance, as well as on some things the IRS needs to do differently. I'd like to thank our witnesses for coming today. I look forward to your testimony. I now yield the ranking member for our opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the focuses of this subcommittee is to ensure that small businesses are given the tools to comply with regulations without increasing their costs. This is particularly true when it comes to taxes and interacting with the Internal Revenue Service. In the past, when small businesses have testified before a committee, they've told us that complexity and uncertainty create difficulty when filing tax returns. Many business owners worry that one simple mistake can lead to a costly and timely audit. And at a time when many businesses are striving to expand and hire additional employees, every hour and dollar counts. As a result of IRS procedures and administrative challenges, small firms must devote greater resources towards accountants and lawyers to properly report income and pay taxes. Over a quarter of small businesses in the 2015 National Small Business Association's taxation survey stated that they spent over $10,000 on tax compliance, and another 8% stated that they employ an outside tax expert to handle tax issues. Unlike larger multinational corporations, the time spent by small businesses in complying with tax laws is much more costly, impacting business expansion, job growth, economic prosperity, and so forth of these small businesses. They should not also have to face intense scrutiny from the IRS through business audits and inadequate IRS compliance with the Regulatory Flexibility Act. Nevertheless, small firms face filing hardships, aggressive auditing and collection procedures, and confusion as to how a new regulation will affect their business. Seeing as our nation's fiscal constraints are an ongoing priority, I understand that closing the $450 billion tax gap is critical to our long-term prosperity, but so are small businesses. Any effort to increase tax compliance must be done in a way that is responsible, fair, and not disproportionately burdensome to small firms. Today's hearing will give us a better grasp of the scope and collection techniques regarding small business audits. This hearing also allows us to examine what is being done to minimize IRS regulatory and procedural burdens for small entities. I believe that this information is even more important right now as the agency seeks to be more efficient due to financial realities. The fact of the matter remains that IRS cannot review and modify the procedures impacting small businesses if Congress continues to cut their budget every year. These actions have weakened the IRS's ability to enforce the nation's tax laws while also providing sufficient customer service for our small businesses. With the proper tools, America's small firms can sustain the economic growth currently underway by investing in their operations without fear of an audit and confusing regulations. With that, I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here today. I yield back.
Thank you for that opening statement, and quick summary again on timing. If committee members have an opening statement prepared, I ask that be submitted for the record. I'd like to take a moment to explain the timing lights for you. You will each have 5 minutes to deliver your testimony. The light will start out as green. When you have 1 minute remaining, the light will turn yellow. Finally, at the end of 5 minutes, it will turn red. I ask that you try to adhere to that time limit. So our first witness this morning is Mr. Pete Sepp, President of the National Taxpayers Union here in Washington, D.C. Mr. Sepp first started with a NTU in 1988. Currently, he supervises their government affairs, public relations, and development activities. Mr. Sepp has testified before Congress on a wide range of tax-related issues and has also been a guest on several nationally broadcast radio and television programs. Mr. Sepp, you have 5 minutes and you may begin.
Mr. Chairman, Madam Ranking Member, I'm honored to be here to discuss a central feature of our tax system, the examination process. Now, back in 1988, my organization, National Taxpayers Union, led a transpartisan coalition which included American Civil Liberties Union and National Council of La Raza, business organizations, taxpayer groups, all on behalf of a taxpayer bill of rights. Now, there have been subsequent coalitions, subsequent pieces of legislation, but one interesting facet of this process has been a lack of focus on improving examinations. They've tended to focus instead on making reforms to the collection process. And so there's a wide range, I think, of problems that have been identified in the small business community that still need to be addressed, particularly pertaining to examinations. I call them fear factors. I think one major fear factor has to do with the complexity of the tax system itself and the uncertainty that brings. The ranking member of the full committee, Congresswoman Velazquez, said this very eloquently in 2013. I quote, "Many business owners worry that one simple mistake can lead to a costly and timely audit, and at a time when many businesses are striving to expand, every dollar and hour counts." Quite true. I also think we have to worry still, again, about intimidation tactics used against small businesses. We're witnessing right now a counter and paradoxical trend here of speed-up audits where businesses are getting audit notices and being asked to respond almost immediately to whether they want to even appeal. They don't even have time to consider the central issues of the audit itself. On the other hand, there are slow-down audits where the procedure drags on and on. Interest keeps accruing through no fault of the taxpayer, and abatement of that interest is a very difficult matter to resolve indeed. We also have the question of opportunity costs. When you look at very small businesses under $100,000 in receipts, they tend to have a tax liability after examination, additional tax of less than $10,000. They could easily rack up that much in legal and audit representation costs. Most of them decide, in my opinion, not to fight it. That's why the audit appeal rate is so low, hovers between 5 and 7% annually. When they have these problems, the remedies in court remain pitifully small. The cap on attorney fees that they can recover if they prevail in court nowhere near matches the amount that they actually need to spend to prove their position. There are other problems on the horizon. We are part of a coalition called the Coalition for Effective and Efficient Tax Administration, involving more than a dozen associations representing thousands of businesses. We're identifying problems, ironically, in the large business and international division, with issuing designated summonses and designating cases for litigation, tactics which are normally supposed to be reserved for a very small number of uncooperative taxpayers or broad-ranging issues, and they're being applied in consistently greater fashion and with more force, and the threat is being wielded to compel taxpayers into accepting the IRS's position. That is going to be a major problem for smaller businesses down the road. Taxpayer experts and litigation representatives like Daniel Pila, who's been before Congress testifying in the past, has said he fully expects those kinds of tactics to migrate into the small business area and the self-employed area sooner or later. And there's the issue, of course, one that's being discussed in committee markup for the Financial Services and General Government Bill. One of your colleagues, Congressman Katko, is offering an amendment to block the IRS from hiring private outside counsel to participate deeply in the examination process, essentially farming out audits. Now, this is currently applying to a large business, $1,000 an hour attorneys. You could easily see $300, $400 an hour attorneys working on small business liabilities. It happens because the IRS may consider the hazard of litigation in an appeals situation. They don't have to consider the cost of that litigation versus the tax due. So we have a volatile situation here. We need to enact reforms ranging from S-2809 by Senator Portman, which would address some of the CETA Coalition's concerns, to the Small Business Taxpayer Bill of Rights, H.R. 1828, to reviewing the taxpayer advocates' most serious problems affecting small businesses, and coming together in a bipartisan fashion to address the factors of lack of trust, lack of certainty, and lack of remedies for small businesses in the audit process. We did it in 1988 and 1998. We can do it again. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sepp. We appreciate your testimony. Our next witness is Mr. Lee Davenport, member of the Electronic Tax Administration Advisory Committee here in Washington, D.C. as well. Mr. Davenport is in his third year as a member of the Advisory Committee, which serves as a public forum to discuss electronic tax administration issues. He is principal of Davenport Consulting, which provides business consulting and private financing services. He was also the architect of MyFreeTaxes.com, which assists those who earn less than $62,000 per year file their state and federal taxes for free. Mr. Davenport, thank you for being here today. You may begin.
Thank you. Chairman, thank you for holding today's hearing on how the IRS could help small business. 28 million small businesses in America are a cornerstone to our economy. Small businesses account for over half of all U.S. sales and 55% of all jobs, and they pay significant amounts of income, employment, and excise taxes into the U.S. Treasury. Helping small businesses easily file and pay their taxes is a critical mission of the IRS Electronic Tax Administration Advisory Committee, or ETAC. ETAC was formed by law in 1998 to make strategic recommendations to Congress on how to improve tax administration and better serve taxpayers, including small business taxpayers, through electronic means. In short, we are objective digital strategy consultants to the IRS. The committee believes that modernizing the IRS taxpayer service communication platform is an urgent and strategic priority for the IRS. In the 2015 tax season, the IRS was in its fourth consecutive year of budget reductions, and IRS service levels plummeted. IRS answered only 38% of its calls from taxpayers. IRS has been unable to modernize its tax service platform to move away from traditional paper and phone interactions. The current phone and paper taxpayer service platform is also not the preferred choice of the IRS or the many taxpayers who expect secure online services. Aligned with this issue is a lack of transparency with the IRS. For most taxpayers, the information the IRS has about them is a complete mystery. It's not easy for taxpayers to access and understand their tax information on file with the IRS, their previous tax-related interactions, or their tax compliance obligations. For small business taxpayers, this issue is even more critical. Because small businesses are more likely to complete multiple year-round transactions with the IRS, in many cases, when there is a compliance issue, small business taxpayers find out through a surprising IRS notice after they file, or even more stressful, an audit that can take months or years to resolve. For all types of taxpayers, accessing and using their information to proactively comply is almost entirely out of the question in the current system. The committee believes that a key solution to these problems is a more digitally enabled, modernized IRS that better equips taxpayers with information on how they can proactively comply rather than solely focusing on detecting and enforcing compliance. In the past 3 years, ETAC has provided recommendations based on a simple vision of how the IRS could serve taxpayers. The vision allows taxpayers to fully understand their tax obligations, to have transparent access to their tax information and status with the IRS, and effectively and securely interact with their tax administrator on the way they want to be served, in the way they want to be served. The end state is a tax system that is less burdensome. It's a tax system that relies less on reactive measures, such as audits, and more on preventative and educational measures for taxpayers to remain proactively compliant. There are two challenges the IRS faces in achieving this vision. First, the current tax system is designed to be reactive. It does not leverage tax information to help taxpayers meet their obligations. Secondly, the IRS cannot quickly develop and implement its digital roadmap, including online accounts, to address the needs or preferences of taxpayers. Our last two reports to Congress explain this dilemma and provide recommendations to overcome these challenges. In 2015, our report to Congress, we recommended that the IRS accelerate its digital taxpayer service strategy. That is, develop and implement secure online accounts for all business and individual taxpayers. We know that businesses are much more likely to use a tax professional for tax filing compliance needs. Our online accounts for these tax professionals should be a priority. ETAC advocates for the IRS to commit to quickly developing online accounts for business taxpayers and the tax professionals who serve them, and we encourage the committee to do the same. In our most recent 2016 report, which actually comes out today, ETAC addresses the look-back tax system that centers on post-filing programs that detect current non-compliance. We challenge Congress and the IRS to move to a system that verifies taxpayer identities and tax return information before accepting the return. Oops. There it is. A system that uses information statements such as Forms 1099 and Forms W-2 to verify taxpayers and their tax return information is essential to fighting fraud and reducing the taxpayer burden. The IRS should support taxpayers in filing accurate returns, giving them full electronic access to their tax account information at the time of filing. This proactive system would verify accuracy upfront and reduce audits, particularly those on small businesses. ETAC was pleased with the IRS's first steps in its digital service plans. IRS released an initial draft of the Future State Initiative in January of this year that specifically incorporated ETAC recommendations from the past 3 years. Initiatives specifically contemplate small business taxpayers and the needs of ETAC, endorsed this digital service components of the future state plans, that they clearly identify the urgent needs of small businesses. IRS needs to accelerate online accounts for businesses and tax professionals. On behalf of the entire ETAC, I thank you for inviting us to testify on this important topic.
Thank you, Mr. Davenport. We appreciate your testimony and your service on that advisory committee. Our third witness this morning is Mr. Roger Harris, President and COO of Padgett Business Services in Athens, Georgia. Mr. Harris has served twice as chairman of the Internal Revenue Advisory Council and has previously testified before this committee as well as before the Senate Small Business Committee. He has been named one of Accounting Today's top 100 people. Mr. Harris, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Chu. It's a pleasure to be here today. To give you a little background, Padgett Business Services provides accounting, tax, and payroll services to small businesses. We are currently celebrating our 50th year and have over 200 offices throughout the United States. We define a small business as someone with less than 20 employees. Now, a lot of people consider that to be a mom and pop type business, but I would remind those people that almost 90% of people who have employees would fit that definition. So it's a very powerful part of our economy. Our history and our relationship with our clients, I think, gives us a good perspective to comment on the interactions that small businesses have with the IRS and, in our case, their representative. Specifically as it relates to audits. No taxpayer, be it an individual or a small business, ever wants to receive that notice that they're being audited. But in a voluntary tax system like we have, there is an element of enforcement that must be present. And so if you're successful and stay in business long enough, there's a good possibility you're going to interact with the IRS in some form of audit or some sort of correspondence with them. Currently, the IRS really executes 2 different types of audits on small business. The one that seems to be most prevalent and use continues to increase over the years is the correspondence audit. Now, the idea behind a correspondence audit is that some computer or some person somewhere in the bureaucracy selects what appear to be some simpler issues, and the small business owner is notified by mail, as the name indicates, that they are to respond to this notice about the specific issues in question. In theory, this is a very good system, and it, I think, is partly the reason that we're seeing more and more of those is for the better use of resources. It eliminates face-to-face, which is intended, again, I think, to minimize the cost and burden that a small business owner or their representative might face. Unfortunately, it doesn't work always as intended. First and foremost, sometimes the tax code's a little more complicated than it might seem. And what looks like a simple issue that can be very easily dealt with through correspondence really has more complicated pieces in it than may be on the surface. And sometimes that lack of face-to-face is a disadvantage, not an advantage. Because the small business owner and their representative sometimes feel like they're just talking to the bureaucracy and they don't really know where their information is and what's being done with it. And if there's something that needs to be questioned or going back and forth, there's not a real convenient process to do that. Probably the thing that we hear the most as a criticism of correspondence audits through our company and our experiences is that there's an inconsistency in the quality of this unknown person responding from the IRS. So in many instances, it's almost as if they don't know the issue as well as the representative or the taxpayer does. And so eventually you really do need to move to a face-to-face environment to get it resolved. So in many instances, what starts as a correspondence audit will only be resolved if it moves to some sort of face-to-face contact. We understand that correspondence audits are going to continue to be probably the preferred method of auditing small businesses, but if that's the case, I think there's three areas that the IRS needs to focus on and address. First of all, they need to do a better job of selecting the issues that really work in this type of environment, so that if it's going to be done through correspondence, it's an issue that really works for. Secondly, they need to have more consistency and better training of their employees in this area so that the cases can be resolved. And finally, I think that something that's very important is their need to develop a tracking system. It's interesting to us that FedEx or UPS can track packages all the way around, but the IRS can't allow a taxpayer or a representative to track the status of their information in their audit. So there needs to be some better tracking of the information as it's submitted and it's going through the process. The audit that I think we all associate with the IRS are field audits, where the people come out and spend time either at the small business owner's place of business or the representative's place of business. The good news for that is you tend to get a more trained and better qualified IRS representative. The bad news is those audits can last days, weeks, months, and sometimes years, and the cost of those are almost exclusively the burden of the small business owner. Again, they are necessary evils, but they can be very costly and very expensive. I agree almost completely with some of the comments of Mr. Davenport as we move forward and online accounts. The IRS is setting up individual accounts, which I commend them for. However, there is a vast need for business accounts and practitioner accounts, because currently about 70% of small business owners have some sort of relationship with a practitioner, and therefore you need to give access to accounts to the people who would be most likely to use them. And businesses right now, unless you operate as a Schedule C, if you're a partnership or a corporation, there are no accounts right now, but I think they need those accounts as well. And finally, even on the individual accounts, which I think are a step in the right direction, and I certainly understand the challenges of identity theft that the service is facing, but right now the service says that the way to authenticate those accounts today, by their own terms, are only successful 30% of the time. So if we're going to have individual accounts, they need to be something that the average person can actually access when needed. So with that, I see my time is up. Again, thank you for being here, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. We appreciate your testimony. I now yield to our ranking member for the introduction of the final witness.
It's my pleasure to introduce Ms. Emily Peterson Casson. Ms. Casson is a coordinator of Public Citizens' Bright Lines Project. The Bright Lines Project was founded in 2008 and works to change the vague test that currently defines political activity for nonprofits. Before joining Public Citizen, she worked as an attorney in ERISA litigation and in indigent representation. She received her Juris Doctorate from Georgetown University Law School. Welcome, Ms. Peterson Casson.
I thank the ranking member for that introduction. Ms. Peterson Casson, you may begin.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Madam Ranking Member, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Emily Peterson-Casson. I'm the Bright Lines Project Coordinator at Public Citizens Congress Watch. Public Citizen is a national nonprofit public interest organization with more than 400,000 members and supporters. For 45 years, we have successfully advocated for stronger health, safety, consumer protection, and other rules, as well as for a robust regulatory system that curtails corporate wrongdoing and advances the public interest. My own work at Public Citizen is to coordinate the Bright Lines Project, an expert team of attorneys and nonprofit partners working for an improved definition of political activity for all nonprofits. I do not need to tell this committee how important small business is to our economy and our society. Congress can and should protect small business by ensuring a clear, predictable framework of tax rules and regulations. Rules that are easy to follow and enforce allow small businesses to thrive while minimizing opportunities to abuse the tax system. The IRS should be doing more to ensure that small businesses can easily comply with the regulations already in existence and work to improve its ability to provide accurate and timely guidance. The Bright Lines Project focuses on nonprofits advocating for a definition of political activity that increases civic participation and creates objective standards for the IRS to follow when enforcing the law. Clear rules are just as important for small business. Indeed, nonprofits can be likened to small businesses with a social mission. At the same time, it is important to recognize the benefits to small business and our society of having a safe and healthy workforce made possible by sensible government regulation. Regulation is also essential for opening up new markets for small businesses and helps incentivize innovation in safer and cleaner technologies. Regulations make our country stronger, safer, cleaner, healthier, and more fair to small business. The regulatory system must not operate to give large corporations an unfair advantage by delaying important regulations or muddying the rulemaking process. Making the rulemaking process too complicated for common sense regulations harms small businesses rather than helps them. The analysis required under SBREFA, for example, can delay the already laborious rulemaking process for months. A recent GAO report, which investigated the slow process of rulemaking at OSHA, found that it takes 8 extra months of work for OSHA to prepare for the SBREFA panel. In addition, small business analysis should be narrowly targeted to benefit small business. Though the advisory panel component of SBREFA legislation often results in unnecessary delay to needed regulations, other aspects of the law do help small businesses comply with regulations and could be expanded to be even more helpful. Supporting and expanding the Small Business Ombudsman and Compliance Assistance programs is a sensible way to give direct, tangible help to small business. The information the IRS provides to business taxpayers is essential to increasing compliance and decreasing small business hassle. However, funding cuts to the IRS in the past few years has made that assistance more difficult to provide. Since fiscal year 2010, the IRS's funding has been drastically cut again and again. Consequences of those cuts have led to reductions in staff available to assist taxpayers and in the training available to that staff. An IRS staff that is adequately knowledgeable and available to small business taxpayers makes filing taxes easier and prevents compliance problems from compounding. Yet over and over, the IRS is unfairly attacked and prevented from fulfilling its mission. Therefore, it is essential that the IRS is fully funded. It is in our nation's interest that small businesses are able to grow and thrive in a society that protects health and safety and ensures that the market operates fairly to businesses of all sizes. Small changes to SBREFA, fully funding the IRS, and ensuring a predictable rulemaking process will ensure that the playing field is level for small business. Again, it is an honor to come before you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Peterson-Casson. I appreciate that testimony, and we'll begin with questions. Well, first, I'd like to direct a question to Mr. Harris. Appreciate your experience as a practitioner and looking at this, and you talked about the correspondence audit, and what do we really know of how the IRS determines who's going to be audited? Is there, I see there was a New York Times article contends they have a secret algorithm. What's your experience and your best guess of what's occurring over there?
They have what they call a DIF score, which is tax returns are scored and compared to some norms of other returns and their prior returns is I guess, the most common way. They also at times target specific issues where they see problems either in a tax part of the law or taxpayer behavior, and sometimes they're just random. They do some audits that are for research purposes, and those are done randomly, and those are done in great depth and detail. And quite honestly, sometimes you just don't know. You see some returns that you think, wow, I don't know why that one's not getting an audit, and one that looks fairly simple gets one. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of different reasons. I'm not sure anybody knows them all.
Okay. A question for Mr. Sepp, and mentioning auditors, how are they currently held accountable when they make errors that might cause catastrophic results for taxpayers and or small businesses?
Well, there are some methods by which taxpayers can seek redress if the IRS either loses documentation or if perhaps a math error on an examiner's part is discovered. That was something brought up to me by an interview I conducted with a tax professional. Interestingly, the IRS issues millions of math correction error notices on its own. Sometimes the IRS's own staff make mistakes in the calculation of a tax. The problem is, beyond going to appeals and assuming the taxpayer even understands his or her appeal rights, getting into tax court or district court is a very expensive proposition. One of the elements of H.R. 1828, the Small Business Taxpayer Bill of Rights, would begin a pilot program for alternative dispute resolution in small business tax cases. That was an idea that had been developed by an IRS Reform Commission some 30 years ago, or 20 years ago, I should say, and it's a good idea now. I think we should move forward with it.
Well, with a tax appeal rate of 5 to 7%, I mean, is this because small businesses are a function of being both scared and as well as not knowing or not worth the price of entry? I mean, been a lot of discussion about large corporations able to draw audits for years. A small business with 20 folks or less, I mean, a couple days is a major crippling factor on their business if they're shut down or have to spend all their time with an audit or an appeal.
Yes, absolutely. And some professionals have reported to me just the basic misunderstanding that when they receive the so-called 30-day letter with an RAR, the report of the examiner as to the issues and the position of the IRS, they think it's a bill. They think they have to pay it.
Who would they call to double check?
It's very difficult sometimes. That is a problem the taxpayer advocate has pointed out, that there needs to be a single point of contact with a phone number that a citizen under examination can get in touch with. And the IRS has interpreted that mandate in a very fluid fashion, one that's not very helpful.
And Mr. Davenport, what is your sense of volume of audit activity? Could that be diminished and more targeted and more efficiently if you follow the recommendations from the council you're on? Can you describe that a little bit more of how we could actually make it more efficient and better allocate the resources and thoughts on that?
I don't know if I could speak to the volume of the audits in their current status. I think that they would be increased. You would have more efficiency in the system if you allowed the small businesses to transparently see the information that's on file. If the IRS presented to you an electronic account or a format that they could say, this is what we have for you, these are the kinds of things we're going to be talking about. They could, as it was previously mentioned, they could track the audit process, the paperwork through the entire cycle of the audit. Their interactions are, as I mentioned, that they're largely unaccountable for, that you can change hands of the audit process several times. You can speak with people on one issue or event in the IRS and speak with another person in another department. They really don't have a way to be able to speak knowledgeably about all the information held in one place at one time. And I think it would improve dramatically.
Well, they have certainly some type of internal processes, but the taxpayer is not privy to those. Or if they ask us who's looking at an X or who looked at it, where it's at, the answer is it's, what do they tell a small business man or woman that's appealing? Where's the appeal at? Will they even answer that question?
I think it would require several lengthy responses back and forth. I think putting all the information we have into the same place and having an important and dynamic conversation about the information that we have at the same time would be fair and transparent for both the filer and the taxpaying service.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Next, I recognize Ranking Member for her 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Peterson-Casson, The Regulatory Flexibility Act, or REDFlex, was passed by Congress, and it mandates that federal agencies consider the potential economic impact of federal regulations on small entities. In fact, it was this committee that created this REDFlex Act over 25 years ago. How can the lack of REDFlex compliance from the IRS impact the ability of small businesses to adjust accordingly to any new regulation?
Well, clarity and predictability are essential to a good regulatory system, to any regulation that comes out. It makes compliance easier and it makes enforcement easier. When small businesses want to comply with regulations and when they don't know when the regulations are coming out, what the regulations will be, whether the regulations are going to affect them, it's impossible to comply. And furthermore, compliance problems, once they start, have a tendency to compound, which leads to a lot of the problems with difficult audits that we've been discussing previously. So, yeah.
Well, this Regulatory Flexibility Act, REDFlex, and the Small Business Regulatory Enforcement Fairness Act were designed with small business compliance in mind. What are the most advantageous aspects of these laws, and could these tools be expanded to further assist small firms?
Absolutely. The best thing these laws do is to provide direct, tangible assistance to small businesses, including creating small business ombudsmen. Most agencies already have one, including Treasury. Those ombudsmen are there to answer questions and provide guides and help small businesses comply with existing procedures. But the program should be expanded to include more outreach, make sure that small businesses know that those resources are available, and also that they can be found easily. There should also be best practices guidelines on how to do that outreach. More compliance assistance and making that assistance meaningful will have enormous benefits. And remove burdens also to small business.
Absolutely. Now I want to ask you about the significant budget cuts at the IRS. The IRS has had those significant budget cuts, and it's resulted in limited resources. Is it realistic to think that the IRS can appropriately and efficiently perform all the duties it's been tasked to do while also reviewing and modifying problem areas like aggressive audits and taxpayer accounts? And how could increasing the IRS budget and therefore increasing personnel address many of the problems we're hearing about today?
In answer to your first question, unfortunately, I don't think it's realistic at all to expect the IRS to carry out its vast mission of enforcing the tax code with the cuts that have been in place. Since 2010, and as Mr. Davenport has mentioned, the IRS has lost about 17,000 full-time employees, including 5,000 of them in enforcement. As we've been hearing, audits are an imperfect tool. Increasing compliance assistance and guidance would, before the problems compound, makes those audits easier, and increasing the training available to staff through adequate funding would decrease the problems that those audits cause as well.
And how about increasing personnel and increasing the budget? What could that do to address these problems that we're hearing about?
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, the most obvious thing that the IRS can do to increase its compliance is answer their phones. As Mr. Davenport mentioned, he cited the statistic that the IRS has a 38% service level on their phones. That's obviously unacceptable. When they do get more funding, as they did, they got a little bit of funding in 2015 to address that problem, the service level goes up. In fact, when that extra funding came in, they were able to hire 1,000 temporary workers and increase the phone level service to about 70%. Now, that's not even talking about the first thing I do when I have a problem or I have a question, which is go to the internet. The IRS needs that extra funding in order to create easy to find compliance guides so that small businesses don't have to wonder what they're supposed to be doing. They should be able to find those answers right away. More funding will make sure that happens.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to recognize Ms. Radewagen for her 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too would like to welcome the panel. Thank you for appearing today. Mr. Davenport, you talk about a system that verifies taxpayer identities and tax return information before the IRS accepts a return. How would this work in practice?
In my mind, there are a few things that would have to change. There are some regulations in place now to bring information returns in earlier, much earlier. Information now from the 1099s and the W-2s passes through Social Security and then gets to the IRS sometime around this summer or late summer. If information was to arrive earlier and then be usable by the IRS, searchable and cross-matched, we could better identify information that was included in that, on those information statements, like W-2s and 1099s, and use it to verify the authenticate the individual. If we, and I think there is some movement in the spending bill this year, the IRS will start issuing refundable credits on February 17th this year. This has some negative impacts for the system, but if you move back the date the refunds come out and you move up the date the information comes in, you have a better chance of matching that information and then knowing who the individual is and if they're getting the right number. And it's not, this is not to stop me stealing his information at a coffee shop. This is to stop the 500,000 returns and refunds that are issued improperly to people who don't exist. They're phantom corporations that file for millions of people.
Given the IRS cybersecurity challenges, as well as those with taxpayer identity theft and refund fraud, how do we ensure that the taxpayer online portals you recommend are secure?
You know, security is an evolving thing. Even 3-4 years ago, we thought out-of-wallet questions were, you know, light years ahead of where we are now. You can find that stuff on Ancestry.com. And this is a pretty common thing that we think that the status of evolving authentication, for me knowing who an individual is, the computer must be smarter than we are, and those are powered by people. Like, people have to make good decisions, and cybersecurity is a big deal, right? So if we can improve that, if we can know who they are, and if we can match their information, we will have a better chance of making those payments correctly. The thing is now, I can choose to interact with the IRS on the schedule I want. I can come in and out of the system at any point. I can file and not file next year, and no one will know the better. I mean, we'll know later, years later, but if we were to create an online system that I could match my information that the company, my employer sent me. I'm a small business owner. If I got 1099s in the mail, and as did the IRS, and I could actually see what was there, what they had, what I had, and in a pre-filing season, I could know my compliance was going to be right, and I was going to file a right return. I could submit my return through an online account, and when they said, "Oh, they would send me a note. We received your return today. Oh, thank you very much. We're going to drop your refund in your account today. Is that okay?" Well, if that wasn't me or that wasn't my return, I would say no, and we'd stop it immediately, right? So I think there are some security concerns around how to do it, but does it need to be done? It absolutely has to need to be done.
Okay, I'm running out of time here, but
Sorry.
I wanted to ask Mr. Sepp. The current audit process seems to be a bit of mess based on a number of issues you identified: lack of centralized management, lack of transparency, flawed IDR process, closing delays, etc. But it appears that many of these issues could be resolved administratively within IRS. What recommendations would you make to the agency to make the process work as intended?
Some of these recommendations are being made by the Coalition for Effective and Efficient Tax Administration, but I think they apply not only to the large business and international division, but small business and self-employed. There needs to be more centralized case management and points of contact. There needs to be much more consultation between the auditors and the audited about deadlines for information document requests, about timelines for completion of the audit, about issues identified in the audit. And I would echo the testimony of several here who say we need better training of IRS staff to focus more intently on the issues and to refrain from tactics such as designated summons or threatening to designate cases for litigation or hiring outside firms. Those kinds of issues, again, are eventually going to migrate into the small business community in some form or another. We need to address those now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
It's my understanding we do have some members streaming in from other committees, and I have a couple additional questions, and other members will have another round of questions. So, Mr. Sepp, you did mention the issue of farming out audits, which new concept to me, and I understand the current system, where we actually do in most states, if not all of them, participate in assisting the IRS and tax administration, which under a fair or flat tax system would be interesting to discuss as well. But the current system, farming out audits to hire private companies where perhaps conflicts of interest, describe why that should be allowed, or your opinion on the IRS doing that, and as they apparently are doing in a number of cases now.
Well, certainly National Taxpayers Union, for its part, has supported in the past allowing the private sector to deliver services more efficiently and effective than government, but you have to draw a line. This is an inherently governmental function involving sensitive information, very sensitive issues, and when a business is involved, of course, anything that gets made public can affect the reputation of the business, its ability to attract capital and the like. This issue was first raised when the Internal Revenue Service retained Quinn Emanuel in an investigation, an audit of a very large firm. And this has led to concerns on the Senate Finance Committee side of all kinds of things. We have privacy issues. We have whether this is worth the expense. We also have the issue of whether this is something that enforces or reinforces the intimidation factor. When you have attorneys at over $1,000 per hour participating in the examinations, we're not talking about appearing as expert witnesses about issues that the examiners within the IRS might need help with, but rather deposing witnesses. That could be very troubling.
Is this a new route by the IRS, or they've been doing this for a long time?
No, it's very recent, very recent. And we're on, essentially, we're ahead of the curve here in our ability to curtail this practice before it becomes commonplace. And as I mentioned, one of your colleagues, Congressman Katko, is already offering an amendment regarding this. Senator Portman's legislation has a somewhat different approach to curtailing the practice, but we need to get on this as quickly as possible.
Well, it seems very shocking to me, and I was actually in a different type of regulatory setting of environmental regulations, but the idea we'd bring in a competing firm to help enforce or decide what permits their competitive firm gets, I mean, it's just beyond unbelievable the IRS would do this as well. So I had Ms. Peterson-Kazan, I appreciate you said you have experience in the nonprofit world as well, and been a lot of discussions that in the last few years, and trying to figure out who gets targeted for audits or selection of special scrutiny, and which has come under a lot of discussion lately. Can you provide any insight? Should the IRS be using special words they target, or how do they pick these out in the nonprofit world for this tax exempt status, which of course raised plenty of concerns, I think, by many folks. Can you describe what they should have done versus what you think they did?
Absolutely. So what happened in that case is that the laws governing what political activity is for nonprofits are so vague that they are not only hard for nonprofits of all stripes to comply with, but they're also very, very difficult to enforce. This is exactly the discussion we've been having here. Compliance and enforcement are two sides of the same coin. So I liken it to a speed limit sign that says don't go too fast. When the rule is that vague, there are going to be plenty of people who do go too fast because they, for whatever reason, and then there are going to be even more people. In fact, the most common thing we hear from nonprofits is they just don't engage. They restrict themselves for things that they could be doing, could be participating in, could be furthering their mission, and they say, we're too afraid, and we're not going to do it. And so the Bright Lines Project exists to make that clear so that everyone can be on the same page.
Yeah, in my conversations with the commissioner, there were things that he told me they could do that no one in the right mind in the nonprofit world would even try to do, because they know they're going to be hit on the wrist or even worse. And but this also ties to the issue is, well, how do you know what you know? How do you find out? And now we're in the middle of just trying to figure out what exactly they were doing in Cincinnati, and which is the subject of other hearings of other committees. So I appreciate that insight. Ms. Chu, did you have any additional questions?
Yes. Mr. Davenport, I was intrigued by the recommendations of the Electronic Tax Administration Advisory Committee. Electronic signatures is just such a basic common sense idea and would allow small business owners to save time and money when filing their taxes electronically. How could such a simple administrative change create efficiency for small businesses and the IRS?
You hit on a multi-year problem, and I think this has come out of IRSAC before as well, but it's the way the Form 94X, the employment form for small businesses, it is a form it's filed, these are filed quarterly, and their employment tax is paid. It is administratively much easier to go to the form, print the screen itself, print the form itself, sign it, and then scan it back than it is to create an electronic account to do this. It's a simple fix, but if we talk about the 80% goal to get electronic filing above 80%, which is going to charter DTAC in 1998, we're close in most categories. Individual filings at 87% of individual taxpayers. Businesses are below 80%, just below 80%, because the 94X series, which there are 20-something million of these forms that come in every year, only about 37% of them come in electronically. And it's something that the IRS has formed a working group on. They did that when I was in my first year in ETAC. They formed a working group in e-services. They'll make recommendations, and they expect to implement those recommendations in fiscal year 18. And so you can see the arc for change is not agile as you might expect in the private sector, but I do think that we're going to see some changes in that soon, because it's honestly just an easier thing to do than not to do.
And what makes implementing these changes so difficult for the IRS? Why has it taken so long? Also, are there any downfalls to allowing electronic signatures, such as fraud or ID theft?
I think one of the things they're dealing with is that an individual must authenticate for a business on behalf of a business. And as a Schedule C filer, of which there are millions of Schedule C filers, it's no problem for me to authenticate myself with my own social. But to do so on behalf of a business, you kind of have to share your own personal identity on behalf of a business as a business owner. And sometimes as businesses grow, that information then has to pass to internal accounting services or external folks. And so, again, it may just be an administrative thing that can change, if we can fix the system and make it easier. But I think they have to think about authentication as a whole strategy. That's just kind of wound up in that. But I'd probably defer to Mr. Harris. He may have a strategy as well.
No, I think your comments are true. We need to move to more electronic filing capabilities. And I think the service, if I was going to be critical, it's the old saying, the enemy of good is perfect. At some point we need to begin to allow businesses there's always a reason not to do something. We need to start trying to find a reason to do something.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Harris, collecting tax debt is possible through flexible collection tools and can be an efficient way of helping these individuals, yet these tools are rarely utilized by the IRS, and instead tax liens, levies, and seizures are used. What makes liens and levies, which are much harsher forms of collection, the preferred method for IRS agents?
I really have no idea why it would be the preferred method, because it's the most cumbersome method. It creates the most difficulties. I mean, I guess if you've exhausted every other tool, and there are, as you said, there are plenty of opportunities through any collection process through the use of installment agreements or offers in compromise or just paying the tab. It should be, in all cases, the place of last resort. And if it moves up anywhere beyond that, then I think something in the system has not gone proper, because, again, that should be the last thing anyone gets to, because that has the most severe impact of all on a small business owner.
I yield back, since I think votes have been called.
Are there votes this early? I didn't know that, so I appreciate that. And we had a gentleman who was on his way and got sidelined with another committee. And so I would like to thank all of you for witnesses for participating today. You have raised a number of issues and potential solutions. I like hearing solutions that require serious attention at the IRS. It seems we have a lot more work to do in this area, but this hearing is a good start. I note the full committee and this subcommittee will follow up with the IRS and other stakeholders on the issues raised today. You have not heard the last from us. It is important that these issues and other related concerns are identified, addressed, and corrected. I ask unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days to submit statements and supporting materials for the record. Without objection, so ordered. This hearing is now adjourned.
So what were those?